everyone. Thank you for attending the Kill Your Darling session. We're going to chat about editing, how you can kind of get those first pages and your manuscript itself all fine-tuned and decide what is necessary and what is not necessary. There was a handout for this, and it should be on the website, so you can go ahead back to that and kind of jog your memory or take notes and stuff like that. But yeah, we're going to just dive right in so that hopefully we can get some questions at the end if we have time. All right, so first slide. All right, so I always do a quick overview first because there are different types of editing that some authors don't know quite the meaning of. So first there is the line editing and copy editing, and they're actually two separate entities. So line editing is much more in depth. It has clarity, consistency, prose strength. You're going in to make sure things make sense. The logic from your brain is getting onto the page. The reader understands things. You're making sure your flow and your structure and your voice is all clear, that you don't say one thing and contradict yourself on another page. And it incorporates everything that copy editing does. And copy editing is the lighter editing. It's similar to kind of proofreading, where you're doing your spelling, your grammar, your punctuation, making sure, again, that blue eyes on page 12 are going to be blue eyes on page 50 again. Then you come to your developmental editing. And that is the big picture, those big moments that really build your story in general. So that's plot progression, your pacing, character growth, your dialogue, and your logic and clarity on there, where, you know, if they are doing math or something, that it all makes sense. So there's different kinds of editing. So you have to think about that when you're going forward on your pages, or if you're going to get people like beta readers or something like that, or a freelance editor who's going to be working with you. It's important to know the difference. Next slide, please. So for your first pages, a lot of people, you know, the strongest way to open that page is to be in the middle of things, in media res, which is, you know, the concept that's gone far back is when Homer was talking and giving stories to the public. It's you're beginning in the midst of action. And that can be either subtle or physical. People don't realize in your first pages, you don't have to start off with the chase, running through the marketplace. You can do, or you can talk about something that is much more internal, something that is like college final exams where you're sitting there and the clock is ticking and you're batting a pencil and you're worried about what's going to happen if I fail these. What is my future like? There's a lot of different ways to bring that action forward. And so when you're doing your first page, the important part about editing those moments is that you decide what is the best moment to introduce your character to the reader. And it should be tied into a moment that changes that character's life somehow. It's going to be the first thing we see right before everything changes for them, that gets pushing them out into the book. So this is really important in Kill Your Darlings because I feel like the first pages are the most difficult get right. You have to write multiple versions of it. You have to be open to deciding, you know, maybe this isn't the right place to bring my character in, or am I even beginning with my first character? Those first pages, I know for me as an agent, I like to see the character you told me about in the query. If you start the book with somebody who is not the main character or the person that I got invested in your query, I'm going to be confused. Like, why is this person now opening your book? Why are they important enough? And this is different than obviously having a prologue. Prologues, you know, there's either you love them, you hate them. Prologues, if you have an opening that introduces a kind of like a setup almost, like a backstory or anything like that, you have to be very careful on what makes sense and what doesn't. Is it necessary information, or is it something that you just find interesting or cool, or you had fun writing? A lot of certain genres really do well with queries. So say if it's like a mystery novel, a lot of prologues end up, you know, we get a glimpse of the first murder before we meet the main character, the detective or somebody who's going to be going after that murderer. In fantasy, sometimes you really don't need them, and they should be short, not long. A lot of prologues, that's the reason they get cut, is because they are, you know, 10 to 20 pages long. Try to stick to 1 to 5. 5 is pushing it sometimes. So for those first pages, decide if you need a prologue, if you really have to do that, or if it's you kind of, you know, dropping hints, dropping little need-to-know information the reader they really don't need to know. Or if you're starting your main character, decide what is going to be the most beneficial and the most engaging. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that beginning can be engaging and how a lot of people fall into different traps, basically. Next slide, please. So again, for your first pages, the key in your editing is going to be voice. This is the first introduction we get to how you as a writer compose on your page. So when you're using your voice, it's really hard to teach voice, which is why in your first pages and through the book, but especially those first pages, it's what grabs an agent right off the bat, is if you have a command of that voice. And a lot of the times, it's because you're varying your sentence structure. You're not going very step by step. So there's a natural rhythm to your characters or your prose. We immediately get sucked in because it feels like it's a natural conversation with somebody, or we're watching a movie and it's like being talked back in our heads. So voice on the page needs to have that kind of rhythm, and the best way to do that when you're editing is to read aloud. And I know it's silly. I hate reading my stuff aloud. If you don't want to do it to yourself, you can actually have somebody with you as well who may give them the first page and they read it aloud. And so if people are stumbling over a certain spot or they are having a hard time getting through a sentence, you can highlight that because it maybe is an awkward area that maybe you need to reword it. Because if it's clunky in the speech, it's going to be clunky in the reading most of the time. A big way of editing for voice is to make sure there's an obvious difference between your main characters and your secondary characters. Not everybody talks the same. Not everybody uses the same vernacular. We're all from different areas, so there's a reasoning behind how we speak to each other or how we describe things. Even how your main character looks at something and reacts to it is going to be different. So their voice needs to be different as well. You need to think about their culture, their dialect, or their accent, or the inspiration for what you're doing. I love to think of your voice as a family passing down campfire stories. We're all sitting around a campfire, and depending on who starts the story or is telling us something, it's going to be different. Kids are going to try to detail things differently than their parents would. The best friend who knows their friend is really scared of ghosts maybe will dumb down the scary bits. So it's really clear if you think of it that way when you go back and look at your characters, because you know their personalities by the time you've finished the book and you're editing now. If you go back and think of it in this way, in the campfire way, you can find ways of tweaking them that make sense to who you have built this whole way. And word choice, again, is a really big aspect of editing. You don't want to fall into weaker verbs or weaker dialogue tags and stuff like that, which we'll talk about. You want to have realistic terminology. If you have a middle grade character, a young child, and they're speaking like grown up, why did you make this decision? Think back on it. Is this just because this is kind of how you process things or you work through things? Or is it a character who is literally a little kid who loves to read or likes the dictionary or something and likes to use big words to seem to get attention or to just feel naturally, I'm a smart person, this is what I do. There should always be a reasoning behind how you're making them speak. And it shouldn't be equal to dumbing down the language just because maybe a reader's younger. So again, if you're writing young, when you go back through the editing, make sure you're not purposefully feeling like you are parsing down the language or the concepts because they're young readers. You have to trust your readers as well. Same for adults. If you're going super kind of basic with some of your stuff, if you're writing for teens, you need to remember that there is a natural way of conveying things. So reading back through that, especially reading aloud, is going to really help you with that. And at the end of the day, rules are meant to be broken. So when you're editing, don't feel like if you have fragments, if you have little bits here and there that don't follow great English rules, because English doesn't make sense anyway, there are outliers. There are things that make your characters more 3D, your scenes more your voice. So don't think you have to stick yourself into a box. There are definitely ways that you can break those rules that can still be natural, can still be authentic to what you're doing. Next slide. A big part of your first pages when you're editing is to make sure there is conflict. This, again, doesn't have to be something wild and outrageous. It can be a little more internal, a little quieter. But again, are you starting with your main character? And if you're not, why are you not? If your query focuses on a character, the agent's going to expect to open the page and see that character. You also want to really keep it active. And active is not in the sense of physical, like running around or explosions happening. Active means it needs to stay in the now. This is one of the biggest things I see in first pages for writers, is that they immediately kind of fall back on character. They're thinking about something that happened a while ago, or they are talking about what's happening now in relation to what happened before. So basically, an event happened and now the consequences are showing up. And I always ask, well, why are we seeing the after? Why aren't we going back and starting with that actual event if it's important enough to bring up? So you want to keep it active. We don't want to hear about memories. We don't want to fall back into flashbacks, stuff like that. And we don't want a lot of info dumping on like how things used to be or why a person is the way they are. We want to be in the now because we've just met this character and we need to understand why we should be invested in this character going forward. So who they are right now. Later on, you can give us more of those memories, give us more of that motivation. But in the first pages, your editing really needs to make sure that that's not a trap you're falling into. It should be simple but specific. Your world building doesn't need info dumping. If you're a fantasy writer, especially, this is something I see in first pages that usually needs to get edited down like crazy, just because you want to establish your world so quickly because you want them to be enmeshed, you want them to be immersed. But that doesn't mean having a big chunk of text strictly dedicated to like describing your world and we completely lose sight of the character or what's happening in the moment. Minimize that. Dot it here and there. The best form of world building I see is that a character is reacting or interacting with the things around them. That gives me world building. That gives me examples of what's affecting them, what's touching them, what smells are in the air, that kind of stuff. So try to really merge it with your prose, because that again gives you this natural flow as if we are walking down ourselves. This is a little bit thing that I like to add. It's not strictly about editing, but it is helpful that when you write your synopsis, that first paragraph in your synopsis should reflect that first scene in your first chapter. So if I read your first paragraph in your synopsis and then I open your book, I should be looking at the scene you just described to me. So again, when you're editing, make sure those line up. Make sure you're getting those details correct. And your opening act should be tying into the beginning inciting event. There's technically two inciting events. The beginning is that conflict. It's that moment that spurs your character out into the rest of the world. It's the defining moment that gives us a reason to keep plowing through the book. Inciting events are different. But make sure your first pages when you're editing, something happens, something compelling happens that changes the character or that gives the character a reason to begin their journey. Otherwise, your first page is going to be falling flat. We're going to be feeling like, okay, just a lot of, here's the character, and this is what this character is like, and we're just kind of going through the mundane, the everyday details. You need something that is going to be a major event in some way. Otherwise, those opening pages are going to flop. Next slide, please. And I want to talk about world building just one more time, just because that is such a huge part of editing, in that you have so many details, so many things that you want to get the reader to know, but you have limited space for that. So again, a natural sprinkling of details is going to be great. When you're in your opening pages, don't do a ton of definitions on things, like giving us a title and then describing what position they hold in the government and then what all of the duties are for that position, and you keep going and going, and then we lose sight again of the now. We need to be in the now. You can incorporate your world building rules as characters going along. I really think of when I'm editing, world building is kind of like the building of a house. It's supportive, but it's not necessary to things. So basically, the world building, if you're building a house, it's going to be the studs underneath the walls. We don't see it all the time, but it is what holds the house up. So a lot of this is, you've got those studs, you've got the nails, you've got everything holding it up, and then we decorate with pictures, paint, photos, family, all the stuff that's in it. That is your world. That is kind of decorating the space, and your plot and your characters and everything, are holding it up. So think of it in that. It's supportive, but it's not necessary. You don't have to make it the main event, because it's not what's drawing us in the most. So there's a you have to have with that. And books that I think have done this very, very well. Michael Buckley's Undertow, the opening for me, the world building was just so natural. And we got a look at what life is like, what this person is going through, what the conflict is right off the bat in a very natural way. And same with Marcus Zuzak with the book Thief. We're immediately drawn into the world that they're painting. So those would be great examples to go and look at to see how this author kind of merging that plot, character, and the place that they are in. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to move past first pages and talk about what a lot of people during their editing, the trips they fall into, the pitfalls. And one of them is obviously show versus tell. And I hate this statement when people just tell writers, show versus tell, don't tell, just show. But they don't explain it to you. They don't tell you what that actually means. And for me, telling is a lot of the time it's the play by play where you say they did this, then they did that, they moved over here. This usually turns into a step by step, almost like a reenact of a scene, and it becomes repetitive. And a lot of the times that's pronoun repetition, where you're beginning a bunch of the sentences with I or she or they. And we start noticing that. Or you use the same sentence structure. They did this, they did that, they went here. And it becomes just monotone. It strips all of your voice, basically. So you have to really watch out for that play-by-play and the repetition behind that. We need to experience as though we are the character. We shouldn't be experiencing something as if we're being told something at a distance. Or again, like you're at a campfire and somebody's telling you a story and you're not actually in it. We want to get that experience as though we are standing by the character. So we should be getting all those sensory details, what they see, what they feel. It's a very silly analogy, but I find it works a lot with my clients, is that you have to think of the character as a onesie. And the reader is going to slip the onesie on. So we can see through the character's eyes. We feel what they feel with fingertips, smell they smell. It becomes so much more 3D because you are literally giving us almost this virtual reality feel to it, basically. You don't want to overemphasize things, so you shouldn't be telling us a bunch of things that maybe the character themselves wouldn't be able to notice or wouldn't be able to know in the book. It should just be from that character's perspective because that's what we're learning from them. Less is always more. Don't go overboard with, you start a paragraph and you in every single one of the sentences. That's not necessary. Again, sprinkling. Sprinkling is the greatest way to do this, is where, they first enter a house and the first thing that hits them is the smell, and they take a few steps and they're thinking about what that smell reminds them of. Then they put their hands down on the table and they can feel the rough texture of the wood. Tie them in with the motions and the reactions. Try not to make it a big info dump. Next slide, please. The other one is what I kind of discussed a little bit of earlier, and that is passive voice. That is the looking back tripwire. It is the most common opening issue I see with authors trying to edit their work, or sending it to me before it's ready. Passive voice is where you kind of fall back on past things. You're looking back. So careful of beginning with there was or were. Like, there was a lot of this happening, or there used to be this. It pulls us out of the now. It pulls us out of the now and back into the past. And then we are, again, forgetting what was the purpose of the main scene, because now we're looking at something that isn't the main scene. And a lot of the was verb pairings is what brings in that passive voice. So snow was falling, the snow fell. Keep the active voice in that. The snow is doing the action. He was walking. No, he walked down the street. You're not changing your tenses or anything, but you're making it feel more immediate, like the author or the reader is in that scene watching it happen in the moment. We're staying in now. We're not looking back. My cat is just stop playing with it. Next slide, please. So a big editing tip I can give you is dialogue. Dialogue has to be very carefully handled, basically. And I feel like the 3 W's encompass how you can really key in on what is necessary, what's not, what you can get rid of, what has to stay. So 3 W's, why do we need it? What info does it supply to the reader? And where is it leading the scene? If you can't answer those questions in a chunk of dialogue, you probably don't need it, and it's there as filler space, which means we're going to get really bored of the scene because it doesn't serve a purpose for us. It's just there to be there. Like the one thing I can't stand when I'm reading dialogue is where something is answered in a way that body language could have answered it. So like one word answers like okay, or that's cool, and there's like nothing else. You can replace that with prose. You can give us body language that gives us the same answer without having to use dialogue. And that brings us to dangling dialogue. Are you going to tag it or are you not going to tag it? So tagging is basically where you have the speech and then it said Dave or exclaimed Patricia. I don't know. You don't always have to tag dialogue. If there's only two people in a scene and we know their personalities, we know their speech patterns, you don't always have to say this person said this or this person said that. You can just leave the dialogue and then go to the next line. That being said is normally a go-to, but don't feel like you have to constantly repeat just they said or he said or she said. You don't have to constantly repeat that. You can get a bit more creative with it, especially when you're using questions or exclamation points and stuff like that. If somebody has watch out exclamation point, I'm going to be a little confused when your tags is watch out, said Daniel, whereas it should be shouted, it should be screeched. Like, get a little creative there. It should still be helping paint the scene for you, bringing us into it. So if something is high tension, you're not just going to put said so and so. Keep that in mind as you're doing your dialogue. It should kind of reflect the feel of the scene as well. And it can always attribute to you understanding your world building. Speech is so much more than just conversation. The way somebody speaks can reflect where they're from, what they experienced growing up. Did they get a lot of schooling or not? Do they use a lot of fragments or not? Do they shorten words for, like, you use slang or anything like that? You can use dialogue for so much more than just giving us some information about what's happening. So keep that in mind, that it should be something that is layered and creative and really attributes to your character and what life they are that you have painted in your story. Next slide, please. And then all the extras. I'm going to tell you what, like, Stephen King says, like, get rid of all your adverbs. That's definitely not true. Adverbs are very necessary in a lot of times. But the ones that really catch you a lot are the dreaded ly words, like softly, softly, simply. Those are kind of not necessary half the time. They're usually what I call whimper words, where you are adding something because you feel like you don't feel strong enough about the sentence and you just want it to be a little bit more. You think it's like, I need something. We're just going to pop something in here. Test the sentence. If you can take something out of the sentence and the sentence is not changed at all, that means it's most likely not going to be necessary for it. And a big one for me is that. That's my crutch word, my whimper word. When I write, I use that all the time. And it's because when we're speaking, we use that. We use it all the time. It's natural in our discussions. But when you put it on the page, it becomes really noticeable. So a big thing is if you search for that in your manuscript, you're going to find a ton. Go into the sentence. If you can take that out and the sentence is fine, you don't need that. Only use, so hard to say it so many times, only use that when it's super important to clarify what's happening in the sentence. So it's usually pointing out something. It's usually pointing out something that needs to be segmented off. Goldie, stop. But yeah, a lot of the whimper words I see the most of are really so, like, they were so good to each other. We don't need all of that. Softly, very is a big one. Like is a big one. The ones that you definitely should keep an eye out for are like seemed and felt, because that ends up being a lot of passive language too. She felt scared instead of, painting the picture. The hair on her arm stood at end. That shows us that she's scared. You're not just telling us, oh, well, she's scared. She feels scared. We should see the body language that tells us that. And one of the things that people use a lot of now, I always add it in just because I see it still for some reason, and I think it's because some places still teach it. Double spaces at the ends of sentences are not used anymore. It's bygone from typewriter era, so you don't need that. And most likely, an editor's going to come back to you and be like, "Hey, I fixed the first few, but you need to go through it and change every single. At the end of your sentences, you need to get rid of that double space for every single sentence." So it's just during your first writing or your first edit, it's better just to go through and fix it for yourself. But that's definitely not used anymore. So keep that in mind. Next slide, please. So one last thing in editing that I think has found, or I have found, is very helpful for you to tackle editing after you've written it, you've set it for a while, you've gotten beta readers, all that kind of stuff. Outlining is really helpful in tackling different forms of critique. So I like to think you can do an outline for each of these points. So you do an outline for your characters. Who are they? What do they do in the story? What's their beginning, middle, and end? Do you have moments for them? Is there purposeful things? Are you listing a bunch of major events for them? So maybe there's too much for them. Same with your initial incident and your inciting incident. If you can outline what leads up to it, what are the consequences for it, what's your motivation with this, what does the character do in relation to this, and then your obstacles, your resolution, how do people get out of things, what are their motivations, who's with them. It helps you keep your mind, it keeps consistency, honestly. I think especially when you're doing things like who is in this scene, who's notable, who doesn't really get mentioned a lot of. I think it helps you keep things consistent and remember who's going where, the moving parts that you're using. But the biggest one, I think, for outlining is arc, the character arc, the story arc, the pacing. You can do arc in a bunch of different ways, but I think outlining that is really helpful because it tells you where maybe you're having an area where did this character change at all through your book? Because if they don't, most likely it's going to flatline for you. The character has to have some kind of growth. They're going on a journey, they're doing something. So they really need to have that kind of emphasis on what's going on that is motivating them and making them the person that we see at the very end. Same with your plot arc. If we start somewhere and go to the end, do we achieve any goals? Do we get our questions answered? If we don't get all of our questions answered, which ones are you leaving unanswered and why? Are you doing it because it could be a possible sequel? Are you doing it because you forgot to tie that loose end up? Very helpful to outline because you've really got to see what is falling through the whole space. Next slide, please. And lastly, I always have to talk about this, beta readers, critique partners, sensitivity readers. There's a difference between all of them. So critique partners, you should always be asking, what experience level do they have? What do you want from a critique partner? It's not just about finding somebody who's excited and wants to read your work. It is about what you're expecting from that person. So when you get a critique partner, you should always be very clear of what you want from them. Do you want them to strictly look at character arc? Do you want them to do overall enjoyment of the story? Did you notice anything that felt flat? Did you notice anything that you really didn't think matched the character? Try to find people who are sharing your interest in your genres. You don't really want somebody to read it who's never read middle grade. If you're writing a middle grade, it should be somebody who at least reads middle grade, if not writes middle grade. Have a discussion before hiring them as a person. Have a discussion as a person. Do you like them? Do you get along with them? If you're already kind of feeling like the personalities don't mesh, you're always going to feel pushback on their advice or their thoughts on your book. You're always going to kind of see it in a negative light. So it's not going to be a healthy relationship. And definitely establish what kind of editing and feedback style you like. Are you somebody who really doesn't want tough love? You don't want somebody to just tell you everything that's wrong with it? Do you want like a compliment sandwich where they tell you what they think is really great, what worked, then talk about the weaknesses or the areas that they thought maybe didn't make sense, and then end with another compliment or something like that? Make sure that meshes with you, because if you get somebody who gives you feedback styling that really doesn't work for you, you've wasted a lot of time and potentially money. If you're not a one-on-one person, you can find groups that do stuff like this, critique groups where everybody swaps pages, so it's not just the spotlight is always just on you and this one person. Everybody shares. So sometimes that's a little less anxiety in producing. So I highly recommend stuff like that. Sensitivity readers and beta readers. So sensitivity readers are often paid because they are doing work for you. Essentially, they are doing emotional work. They are doing a job in that sense. So a lot of sensitivity readers do charge for services. So keep that in mind. These people are often your readers because they are an authority on something. They have experience in whatever you're writing. So they have more of a voice to be like, look, you got this wrong. This isn't accurate. Or, like, say you're writing about motorcycle people and you're describing the motorcycle parts incorrectly. These are the kinds of people that are going to be reading it to tell you, make sure you've got all the facts correct. But it's also very necessary if you are writing anyone of marginalized identities, mental health themes, BIPOC, LGBTQ, anything like that. You should have beta readers in the culture or the identity and stuff of the people you are writing, even if you share that identity, but especially if you don't share those identities and stuff like that. You need to have beta and sensitivity readers because they can be the people who point out not only the strength of the story, plot holes that maybe you got some details wrong, but they can also talk about things that maybe are red flags, that if you haven't experienced something, that maybe this doesn't mean what you thought it meant, or the stereotype you're following that you didn't mean to. um, Again, you have to remember not everybody's experience is the same, so you don't have to take all feedback. Whenever someone gives you feedback, it is your decision to take that and work with it, or decide, this isn't quite what I want for my book, so thank you, but no thank you. The key is that sensitivity readers are not there to hold your hand. They're not there to coddle you and just tell you the book is great. They are there to specifically raise red flags if there are any. That is legitimately what they are supposed to be doing. So if you aren't going to be listening to it just because you're getting defensive or abrasive, you need to reflect on that. If you're going to decide to go against a sensitivity reader's feedback, you also need to embrace the fact that you may get pushback from readers if you ignore it and publish it, and people notice what that person noticed. So just try to be aware. Sensitivity readers, I can't talk, are not going to be there just to tell you things are good. They are going to be there to tell you other things. So keep that in mind as you go on, definitely. Hopefully, we have time for some questions now, I believe.
So, hi, I have got a couple of questions for you. So, the first one is from Lucy, and she has asked, how do you use cliches effectively?
Ooh. Interesting. I'm not certain if you mean cliches as in like plots or story arcs, or if you're talking about characters. Character cliches you have to be very careful about. Um, I think you need to make sure that the cliche you have chosen to focus on is really integrated into your plot, that it is a necessary component of the story, and it's not just kind of there for nostalgia factor, or it's not just there for a wow factor kind of thing. Um, Cliches can be very effective when you really make it part of that story. So, for instance, cliche as in like somebody has, hard to think on the spot with this one, man. Um, the person next door, the boy next door kind of thing, where the cliche is the girl is pining over the popular boy next door and doesn't know what to do. Um, you can obviously, we've seen that done many times, and when they're done with greatness, it's when it's a cliche in there, but the character is more than just that. You give them 3D like specs, you give them more hopes and dreams, you give them more drama and conflict and stuff like that. So I think cliches can be really great, but they shouldn't be what holds the story together, basically, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
That's a hard one because it's very dependent on stories.
fantastic. And one last question, because I know we've kept you over time, so very grateful to you for spending time with us. But I think this is a great one. I know people are always looking for resources. So, do you have? Well, the question was, what book would you suggest reading on writing and self-editing? But I want to expand this. Do you have any other resources?
Yes. So I have a list.
A whole list.
I totally have a list of. I just have to find it now. Oh, here we go. Okay, okay. So there are a bunch of craft books that are great. The Emotion Thesaurus by Angela Ackerman is fantastic. It gives you a lot of show versus tell stuff. Angela Ackerman, just in general, has a lot of resources on her website, so I would look for her. Um, excuse me. Writing the Other is a great one that basically helps you understand the work and research that goes into writing characters that the backgrounds are different than your own. So it is definitely a pivotal one if you're going to be writing any kind of character that's a little bit outside your lane or anything like that, or incorporating a lot of diversity. It's a great one to do. Um, Structuring your novel is good to really figure out that 3 act structure. Figure out what you are going to be using as the bones of your story, basically. It'll help you get those juices flowing and make sure that you have stability in every kind of structure act of your book. That's what I'm trying to say. Self-editing for fiction writers, and that's by King and Brown. That's for line level issues, like flow and style and like copy editing and stuff. That would be a great one to go look at. Um, and then I think the great one that I would suggest is Voice, and it's by James Scott Bell. That helps you hone your narrative and character voice. That one gives you a lot of tips for that. From freelance editing, I've compiled a bunch of these titles from like other freelance editors and stuff I've learned along the way. But those ones I think are really, really helpful to really just fine tune when you're editing, focusing in on those details, making sure you've checked all your boxes, and really just 3D effect. I think that's the biggest thing, is that you don't want it to feel too surface level. You want to get that internalization. So I think those titles are very, very helpful.
Thank you so much. So, if anyone wants to find you after this, can they hunt you down on Twitter, Instagram?
Yep, you can all find me on Twitter as Red Pen Kaitlyn. Instagram, I'm KJ Belcastro. And if you are looking for freelance editing or anything like that, I am at strictlytextual.com. Um, and yeah, I welcome people to find me, and I try to post a lot of, well, I post a lot of animal pictures, I'm not gonna lie. But I try to definitely put up, tips and tricks and just being part of the community. So I look forward to getting to know people and everybody hang out.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm
Thank
going
you for
to
having me.
switch over to our break, but thank you for joining us, and hopefully we'll get to hear from you again.
Sounds good. Everybody have a great rest of the day.